going for housing growth, supporting growth through development levy system. And now there was a drop-in session that some councillors and elected members were able to attend on the 4th of February, so thank you for going along and asking some questions at that. The draft submission was made available through the Resolve system on Monday. I understand also we could just cover that Ahakura have got their submission in to us this morning, so just if we could perhaps cover how we can appropriately incorporate that, that would be helpful. But I think on that note, I might just, I'll pass over to you as the lead, Michael, and you could just for those online, perhaps just introduce the rest of the team so people know who's in attendance. Thank you.
Kia ora. So I'm Michael Burns. With me I have Ilse Gertelli and Andrew Duncan, who've worked hard on this submission over the past couple of months. So in February last year, the Minister for Housing announced their intention to replace the DC system with a new system of levies. It was identified that there were challenges with the existing DC system, including an inability to fully cover councils to fully recover the cost related to growth infrastructure, particularly where the council's been unable to plan for that infrastructure. Another challenge was that the shortfalls in that infrastructure, that funding recovery, would fall on ratepayers, and that councils were limited in their ability to respond to changes in the in actual growth on the ground compared to what they'd planned for. On top of that, we also have the administrative challenges for councils in preparing complicated DC policies. So the key objectives that the Minister put forward in February for this new system was, one, that growth should pay for growth, and two, that we should have a system that is more responsive could be a user error. Oh, there we are. Thank you. And a system that's more responsive to the actual growth we see. So consultation document on this was produced last year, along with an exposure draft for the proposed legislation. And the team have been working through the details of that, and Ilse and Andrew will go through the details. At this stage, I suppose what's key to note at a high level is that some parts of this we support and we've gone through. Others we feel need more work, and in some cases DIA have noted that they are work in progress, and we feel that they need more work, or there are challenges in what they're proposing in terms of achieving the objectives. So overall, the Council's providing a pretty fulsome submission, but it's one that ends up being relatively neutral at this stage, because we don't feel we have enough information to be fully supportive of this proposal, and that to attest that we believe it will we're not ready to say that it will deliver on growth paying for growth and delivering a more responsive system. Other key things we need to think about at the moment, as also mentioned, is how this works in terms of other RMA reform, but also how this might work in terms of rates capping proposals. And when you think about both rates capping and development levies together, that could pose a challenge in that limits on the council's ability to fund the non-growth portion of investment. As Chair mentioned, we have two additional attachments that will be attached to this submission that were distributed this morning from Watercare and from Hokura. So it's good. So the other important thing to note at this stage is that this is a consultation document produced by the Department of Internal Affairs. This is the first kind of structured stage in our engagement. We have been having conversations, and this process will continue, as the team will outline, through ongoing engagement with the DIA, and then through the normal legislative process with submissions on to Select Committee. So I'll hand over to Ilse to work through the details.
Oops. Did this work? Okay. Is this working now? Okay. So very quickly, run through of our submission. As Michael mentioned, just before Christmas, the government released a consultation document that set out the proposal. The consultation document described the proposal and had a set of questions. These were very technical questions, focused on very specific issues. So in our submission in Part B, we have responded to the specific questions they asked. They also released an exposure draft of the legislation, the Local Government Infrastructure Funding Amendment Bill, but however, this was not the complete legislation. So in Part C, we provide a clause-by-clause feedback on the exposure draft. However, we've also taken the opportunity to bring together our feedback on at a strategic level in Part A, and that is what we will run through very quickly this morning. As Michael mentioned, we've also included feedback from Watercare, and we'll include their detailed feedback in Appendix A, and we've also included feedback from the local boards. We had feedback from 11 of the local boards, and that is compiled and included in Appendix B. Okay, Andrew is going to first give a really quick description of the levy system.
Just before you kick into that, Andrew, I'm sorry, will the appendix from Haukura, will that be Appendix C?
Yes, although we might reorder it, but yes, it will be included as an appendix. Oh, the Secretariat, from the Haukura Secretariat, yes.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
The development levies will be across a whole city, if it's Hamilton or Christchurch, for each of the activities like stormwater or transport. However, for Auckland, given our scale, the government's providing for us to have more than one levy area. Not a lot, but more than one. For that area, we would establish the infrastructure needed to support growth in the long term and set an average charge for all the development in that area. And this differs from what we do with development contributions, so it breaks some of that connection that you have to have at present between individual developments and what's being individually planned. And this will give us potentially, as Michael pointed out, greater revenue certainty and making sure all developments contributing. But it also means that the council has more flexibility in the long run to adjust its investment plans to reflect where growth's actually happening, and that's one of the other goals of the government in this context. But recognising that there is the potential for some investment required to be quite expensive in some areas rather than others, where there is a really marked difference, we can put a high cost overlay within one of these broad areas to reflect that. Ilse.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Part A draws together 5 strategic themes, and the first one is that we really believe that it's essential that the Council's growth, infrastructure, and financial strategies work together as a coherent system that supports growth within the financial capacity of a community, including ratepayers and developers. But right now, there's a lot of reform happening in the wider system, and we are concerned about how it's all going to work together. The new resource management system has been introduced, and Council has just made its submission on the Planning Bill and Natural Environment Bill. Under the new system, there'll be national direction that will impose new requirements on Auckland's growth strategy, and then we need to consider how our infrastructure strategies respond to be able to service growth. our asset management plans, our 30-year transportation strategy that's currently under development, the water services strategies being developed by Water Care for water and wastewater and by Council for stormwater. The proposed development levy system is an essential part of the wider system. It needs to support Council's growth strategy, enable the delivery of infrastructure, and provide sufficient revenue to cover the costs of required infrastructure. If the system design falls short and does not allow councils to recover the full cost of growth infrastructure, it will impact our ability to deliver on our vision for growth and our ability to be responsive to growth. As you know, the government has also recently proposed the rates capping, which you have discussed at length, and we note that even if levies are able to pay for growth, there will still be pressure on rates to fund consequential OPEX and the renewal and levels of service components of infrastructure works. So we're very focused on understanding how all of the parts of the system will work together.
Some of the key things that our submission emphasises laid out here, I'll highlight a few points. Yes, Auckland will be able to have more than one levy area, but we would like the legislation to give us the discretion to have more than one or just one if, after you, having considered all the issues, decide that's appropriate. So we'd like the discretion kept in our hands for that. Also a point we're emphasising that while the legislation does at present provide for us to look at the long-term investments required to support the scale of growth and infrastructure Auckland's going to need, we were really emphasising the importance of that. We need to be able to include and recover costs for investments we're making 10 or 15 years in the future, given the scale of some of those investments and the cumulative impact that growth occurring now has on our future needs to provide for that. But in planning into the future, we're also wanting the government to not require us to have to list every individual project looking out 30 years. This is both not necessary for us to set fair charges, but also to some extent would be slightly at odds with their desire for us to be able to be flexible in the future and to respond to where growth's occurring. It's got some admin costs as well. So when we take that and calculate it, we have to have a fairly sophisticated mathematical methodology for working it out, and how this is provided for can have some material effects on the extent to which we are able to get the revenue that allows growth to pay for growth and us to invest in the broader points Michael was making earlier. So we're looking for that methodology to be more in regulation or via the oversight of a regulator rather than specified nationally. Now, there are some benefits from elements being specified nationally to have a consistent system, but that needs to be able to reflect differences between territorial authorities across all of New Zealand to reflect the particular circumstances of Auckland and Gore. And I noted there's talk of a regulator. Now, if development levies proceed and there is a regulator and rates capping does as well, and that's regulated, then I think we think it's important that it be the same regulator so they can take into account the interactions in terms of our financial strategy and delivering on the infrastructure to support growth that Ilza and Michael emphasised the importance of before. Thank you.
Okay, the next theme is about managing unanticipated growth. And one of the issues with development contributions is that charters cannot be applied in new areas unless it's set out in policy. And we have had that experience recently. It also struggles to deal with changes in growth patterns. So the proposed system seeks to address this by including ways to deal with what is called unanticipated growth. So unanticipated growth can be outside a levy area, for example, through a fast track application or private plan changes that is outside the urban area, or it could be inside a levy where a development seeks to significantly change the density of an area or change the use so that it increases demand in an area. Under the proposed levy system, these situations would give rise to what they've termed a bespoke levy assessment, which effectively requires the council to assess the infrastructure requirements imposed by the new application and consider the options for dealing with it. And we support the inclusion of this aspect, but at present it is actually unclear how it will work in practice. In particular, how will it be defined? What situations give rise to this bespoke levy assessment? Currently, the proposal is it links to the RMA activity status. We don't actually think that works. It's also unclear what happens after the bespoke levy assessment is undertaken. We understand from our discussions with DIA that the council would then have a number of options. For example, it could extend the levy area, it could apply a high-cost overlay, it could enter into a development agreement. These are all possibilities, but we really need to see more details to understand how this works in practice. Next.
So there are a couple of other matters in relation to DLs that we've set out here. We've made some observations about how the new system may interact with Maori land and asked the government to consider that, and Hokura's submission is attached as well. And there'd be an opportunity in our further submissions or any updates to our contributions policy, and if we do, and when we adopt a development levy policy, for you to consider how that's managed. I note that the legislation provides for there to be a transition from the current DC system through the first stages of the introduction of development levies in 2028 through to 2030, where the prices would only go up by a third each year. Our submission opposes that. By the time we get to 2028, we will have had 3 or more years since this was announced. And if there is a transition with prices phased in, that's revenue that's benefiting from growth that we wouldn't receive, that would have to be made up by rates or lower investment. So we don't support that. Just to emphasise again that we have some support for regulation, but it does need to reflect the specific circumstances of Auckland, and it's better if it's more flexible as opposed to being rigid.
Yeah, and we've already talked a little bit about the planning system, but we do think that this is an area that needs a lot more clarification, how it will not only interact with the current RMA, because the system will be introduced while the RMA is still in effect, as well as the new planning system, and there will be a transition period, so that will be rather messy, without doubt, so it needs to be able to provide for that transition area as well. And lastly, under the wider water reforms, the government has encouraged councils to join together to set up new water organizations. Overall, the proposal set out by the government is that the development levies should be available to water organizations. However, the draft legislation does not provide for this. It only provides for territorial authorities to require development levies. So WaterCare has been very involved with us on this and has provided their specific feedback on the changes that it would require to ensure development levies are workable for water organizations in general, but also for WaterCare in particular. Currently, WaterCare is prohibited from using development contributions, prohibited by legislation, and instead apply infrastructure growth charges, or IGCs. But WaterCare would like the option to opt into the development levy system should it be workable for them. So we have Rebecca Van Son online in case there are any questions about WaterCare's views. Lastly, just a timeline. The submissions close on Friday. After that, the government has signaled that they will be introducing the levies bill in May this year. We will then, as Michael noted, have the opportunity to make a formal submission to that process. Their intention is then to pass the levies bill in the first quarter of 2027. And that would mean that council would then have to develop their development levies policy and then be able to charge development levies from July 2028. And as Andrea mentioned, there'll be a 3-year transition process, and then they would seek to repeal the development contributions provisions as of July 2030. 2030. So that gives you an idea of the time frame that they are working to. So with that, that is our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I'll just welcome Rebecca online too from Watercare. Okay, team, we'll move into some questions. Could I just start off with one around the local board feedback? Because my understanding is probably from the local board's perspective, from a number of them, whatever's collected from their local areas, they're hearing from their residents that they'd like it spent back in their local area, right? Where this has kind of got different drivers and going for different outcomes. So I just wondered if I made a correct assumption there, and obviously there's probably different expectations.
Yeah, I think that's, so overall the feedback was generally supportive, but as you rightly point out, there is concern about making sure that that investment is spent in their local board areas. I guess it's important to understand that there is the wider process for collecting development levies, but then there's another process for council to decide and determine where it's going to invest money. And we want to make sure that it's not so prescriptive that restricts the council's ability to make its own decisions.
The key thing is that obviously now with DLs, it will be at a higher level, but the nature of investments will be determined by the capital program, which then would flow into the development levies in the way it does with DCs, but obviously a bit more detailed with connections with DCs, but still driven by the broader capital program that you decide on after considering local board input.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we've got a list holding here. Okay, we've got Councillor Newman, followed by Councillor Filipina at this stage. So, Councillor Newman, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the comprehensive submission, which I think addresses a number of points. I understand where the government is seeking to go on this. I'm broadly supportive of that, but the breakdown of the causation nexus will be a concern for developers, because they will see this as a risk of causation nexus is weakened, local government seeking to charge for the cost of growth that council interprets, which is not linked to the growth that developer caused. What's our response to the development community on that?
There won't be the same quite as strong link between individual developments and charging as there is with development contributions. Some of our development contributions are still charged over quite broad areas, representing some averaging. That is one of the trade-offs of going for a system that provides the council with a more secure and in many respects fairer revenue stream. Development popping up that we hadn't planned for will have to make a contribution that they don't now. There isn't a perfect system. There are some trade-offs here, but we would see a system that if this can actually deliver on the government's objectives, then that trade-off's worth accepting.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. The concern that I think the developers would have, and maybe I have a bit of a concern here too, is that, okay, so we don't have to codify every growth project in a development levies schedule or that, because we're going to be a bit more flexible here. But I still want to ensure that growth-related infrastructure required in a given community is actually the cost of that will be met, that we will actually deliver that, because there are projects in my ward that should have been delivered, paid for by DCs, which haven't been, because we ended up not doing it. We moved the money elsewhere, or we just said, well, we can't afford the council's share of the capex cost because of debt and rates and what have you. So I guess there will need to be some sort of mechanism to ensure that we do honour our commitment to meet the growth-related infrastructure that communities need. Any comment on that?
The legislation also provides for that. So if we've included aggregate cost within an area, we will need to show that we've spent that in that area, but that will form part of our overall capital budgeting process and ensuring that there's an appropriate link between the spatial planning, the infrastructure strategy and our financing, which if development levies allow us to improve our financial position, and as Michael pointed out, we have to wait and see the detail, that may help with that, but we'd have to account for what we've done afterwards.
And just to add, I think to your earlier point about the causation nexus, that's part of what we're still looking for, right? That will come through the regulations, and where the detail of how that causation beneficiary calculation will work going forward is yet to be fleshed out fully.
With your indulgence, Chair, I've got a couple of other questions. Is that okay? Thank you. Can I just to confirm that this levy system would be, we're seeking for this to be available for community investment in sport and rec space, and so we're looking for this to help us to, for example, to purchase lands for parks and reserves. Is that okay? So often those costs are significantly determined in part by the value of the land that we seek to purchase, which generally means that some parts of Auckland will be significantly more expensive than others. But we need the space everywhere, and we need the space irrespective of the value of the land that we seek to purchase. So does this become a bit of a problem, because we'll actually in some places need a lot more cash than others, but the growth might not have been necessarily linked to the value of the land of that area?
And Auckland will be able to have more than one levy area. So when you are considering the appropriate levy area for reserves acquisition, for example, that factor you've identified will be able to be taken into account in how those levy areas are formed.
Two more questions. I do think that there is possibly a misconception by the officials that are advising government that growth is not just growth in the neighbourhood, growth of the footpaths and the local roads, what have you. Growth also contributes to the impact on the transmission infrastructure, which is a significantly higher growth component, but hard to always quantify that growth, because of course there's a significant benefit to the existing community too. For example, the obvious one would be the North Shore Busway, which was subject to judicial proceedings when the DC's policy was developed years ago. How flexible is this regime, or this funding mechanism, for the big transmission infrastructure cost of growth as opposed to the local growth component? Because we are going to need to find from growth significant funding that will be needed for plants and busways and what have you, which isn't necessarily completely attributable to that new subdivision that the developer wanted to build.
Yes, so I think in the similar way to we do now with our large region-wide funding zones for DCs, that would still be available to the council for those large infrastructure projects that have a wider benefit, either region-wide or sub-regionally. And I think this move to larger levy areas probably supports that. So I don't see a challenge in terms of those large kind of generational projects. I suppose the real challenge there remains the council's ability to fund any non-growth portions of that.
Yeah, all right, and I agree with that. And the final question I had to you, Chair, is the recommendation at para 184. This is the contracting provision that we seek for Veolia, which is critically important for Councillor Winiata, Councillor Baker and myself in terms of the franchise that applies with Veolia. How confident are you that the officials that are advising government actually have some degree of knowledge of this predicament? Because it is the bane of my life that a capital constrained or a capital starved third party contracted franchise effectively can't pay for things that can happen everywhere else because of the nature of the franchise and the control of the levying of developers.
Yeah, so we did actually raise that in direct conversation with DIA, and Rebecca was at that meeting, so I will turn over to Rebecca to respond to that.
Good morning. As Ilse said, we have raised that directly with the legal team at DIA and really explained and workshopped the issue. So they are well aware, and we will work with them further for the next round of legislation. They noted that this was a one-off, and they recommended that we provide them with feedback, with wording actually. So we intend to do that. And we have been working with Veolia. We've had some meetings with them. So we'll work together to come up with that wording.
Very good. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Filipaina.
Tamari here mana. Good morning, Chair. Tamari kia koutou katoa to everyone. There's only one, and Andrew, this is to you in particular, because I'm just heading into... Andrew, I'm referring to slide 4, and you mentioned, you spoke about the high cost overlays and in particular the reference on the PowerPoint, high cost overlays may be used in areas within a levy area where the cost of infrastructure is significantly higher and additional levy. Is there currently in the DC policy the ability to do that? I'm looking at the optics. When you end up seeing additional levy, I mean, that is not going to be a positive outcome for our community. So is there anything we will be referencing that, or is there anything currently in the DC policy that looks at the council charging additional levy? Kia ora.
So neither development contributions nor development levies address the consequential operating expenditure that flows from these investments. They come from general rates. As far as high cost areas go, that'll be something that the council is able to consider when it adopts a development levy policy. So that will all be laid out clearly. There'll be some choices there for you to weigh up at that point in time. We do have some areas that are quite a bit higher cost than others in our development contribution policy at present. In particular, there are some areas with quite high stormwater investment charges, even outside those investment priority areas we discussed in May last year. And that reflects the particularly nature of the water catchment and the level of investment required to protect properties from stormwater and big events. So we have a bit of that at present, and in terms of how that impacts, we would expect those charges to fall on the value of land in the area, not the house prices.
Kia ora mana.
Thank you, Al. So speaking order is Member Wilson, followed by Councillor Ferry, and Councillor Hills, then Councillor Lee at this stage. So Member Wilson. Thank you.
Kia ora. I'm acknowledging, I've got two pātai, through the chair, I've got two pātai. The first one I'm acknowledging in your response in the MIS, the Māori Impact Statement, that you acknowledge there's no explicit reference in the Crown's submission. And then as you talk to this submission here, it highlights potential implications. I guess I'm looking at the submission that Haukura has there as an attachment, where it is very specific around the impacts on iwi Māori So my first partai is, other than an attachment, what's the intention in incorporating potentially this as part of the Auckland Council's submission, especially given when we continue to talk about the Māori economic development, and specifically about iwi infrastructure co-investment, transparency around investment te treaty, all of those things, they're not potential, they will have direct impact. So I guess that first partai is what, at this juncture, is going to be included by way of the Haukura submission.
So at this stage, we look to include that Haukura submission as an attachment to the submission that needs to go on Friday. I think our intention is to continue to work with yourselves and the Haukura Secretariat to work through those issues that have been identified and ensure that our ongoing engagement with DIA is informed by those, and then bring those together in the submission on as legislation comes forward through the select committee process. So that's our intention at the moment.
So previously, as it relates to the planning bill, all those sorts, they're incorporated as part of the submission. But are you indicating that this will be considered as an attachment and further work will be done later? Because clearly the submission date is on Friday, and here we sit today, so that it's
Yes.
emphasising. Can I ask why that would be the situation, when in fact all previous and support thereof is usually indicated by way of incorporation?
We just feel that a number of those issues need to be worked through with the broader council. We don't feel that at this stage they can be incorporated into the submission without the committee having a chance to work through the implications of those for the wider submission. And so we think that needs some time to work through those, what the implications are for the council's position on other parts of the bill. And then that allows us to take a more informed position going forward and into those next stages of our engagement with the Crown.
Just one more, if I can, through you, Mr. Chair. I talked to the notion of the Māori economic development and growth and the like, and yet, I guess by way of attachment, it doesn't in fact support, it's attached to a document. It's not what we would reflect, because what I've just read out to you in 3 component parts of the submission, Haukura submission, relates to Te Tiriti, which Auckland Council has supported, as you know, relates to infrastructure co-investment, which Auckland Council supports, as you know, and transparency of investment, which is all about accountability, which Auckland Council supports. It stumps me, I guess, to think that those specific things can't therefore be part of a submission that's supported.
So a number of those are already raised in the core submission that has been through this committee, including the treatment of Māori freehold land and remissions, and so those are already in there. But I think the other issues, I mean, some of them, obviously the support for Māori economy should be simply worked through, but some of the other issues I think may just take some time just to carefully incorporate into our future work.
But good to understand the reticence that's being expressed. I'm not talking about the meeting here, but there should be some kōrero to be had to have the trust and confidence that should be had at this level, but is absent.
So if I can just add, I think a key issue here is just time. I mean, having received the feedback this morning, we haven't had the time to give it due consideration and flow it into the submission itself. So some complex issues, it'll just take some time to work through it. More than happy to have it attached, raise these issues, we can have those discussions with government officials, and there is a further opportunity through the Select Committee submission to provide a much more detailed integrated submission when we get to that stage.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ferry.
Sorry, I withdrew my question. It had been answered. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hills.
Kia ora, Chair, thank you. My first question is complicated, but how does, well, okay, they're all connected, but I'll go with the first one. The transition period, how do we ensure we don't get a rush, like all these things we'd often, so we'll have a rush in this 3-year period of people just applying for huge number of dwellings they may not ever do, but they'll get ahead of this. What belts and braces approach do we put on there? Because a 3-year kind of transition may be good on to help us shake it out, but for that rush of consents while the market hopefully is ticking up seems like a bit of a risk.
Yes, that is a risk that we've identified in our submission, and we think that that could be a challenge. The differences is something similar to we often get with our moves between development contributions policies, particularly given obviously our consultation requirements and stuff, that things often get flagged earlier. There is, in this case, an expectation somehow that development levies will be a whole lot higher than development contributions. I think that remains to be seen until we actually have the calculation methodologies come through. And, you know, in any case, that will be reliant on the capital program that the council commits to and growth projections.
Yeah, just to add to that, the proposal does actually include some provisions on an ongoing basis to deal with sort of the gold rushes as happens. It provides for, once you have a proposed levy policy, it is in effect immediately. It doesn't have to be adopted. It also provides for a reassessment. So if the development levies haven't been paid, there is a process for reassessing them to the new thing. So over time, that is actually built into the system. However, it doesn't deal with that immediate potential that people will put in applications prior to the new development levy policy.
And thank you. And you mentioned rates capping in the submission, but we're not exactly clear. Like obviously the incentive is that developers would kind of develop where they want as long as they can pay these much larger levies. But how are we incorporating the fact that the rates cap because of the OPEX and the depreciation will have a far greater impact on our rate than the CapEx? How do we get across that, you know, yes, it might sound nice that we've put $500 million of levies on, but suddenly we've got far more expensive consequential OPEX sitting out there, whether it's the buses connecting or the staff or the regulatory teams having to travel further. Like, how do we get, because I think it can look like a free money thing, but it actually costs us a lot more.
Made right at the beginning. This is not just about the capital, it's about the overall growth infrastructure and our financial strategy and what the balance is in the council setting its long-term plans, both in a capital and an operating sense. We'll have to, or even if development levies are great, there'll still be those issues to balance through the process that you work through for your long-term planning.
Okay, and last question, just because I'm skeptical, I've spoken to ministers about this, is that it sounds great, but actually I think they will be shocked at what is growth paying for growth. And so when you look at the Dalmours of the world and other fast tracks coming at us, are we ready to have that conversation, or do you think we'll just end up in court with, hey, your development levy is actually $600,000 per dwelling? Because that's what it, you know, Dalmour's like $1.5 million per dwelling, just on the main infrastructure. Like, how will we actually tell this story in a real way?
Yeah, I think that probably comes back to that earlier point that there's not enough detail here for us to make that call. and that's why we've had a very long but still neutral submission, is that there is a lot of detail there, but still not enough for us to know exactly how it will work in practice. I think the regulated nature may support a hopefully less litigious system going forward. But until we know the details of how these calculations will work, what can and can't be included, and how the calculations, what oversight there will be, it's hard for us to establish how that might pan out.
Okay, and just last question on the regulator, since you brought it up. Does this necessarily, will it mean the regulator ends up becoming sort of another unelected body, like the rates capping body that we don't know what it's going to look like, who will end up deciding if our project's capital infrastructure is worth it, or we, this body and local boards decide we need X thing, but the regulator says nah. Is that what we could end up with again?
Yeah, so the proposal has, a lot of things through a regulator, and, regulations set at a national level to standardise things. In some ways that's helpful. It sort of gives developers confidence that, it's not just one individual council, trying to charge too much. But on the other hand, it depends on the quality of that regulation. Will that regulation work for Auckland? So in the submission, we've talked around, there are some positives for having regulation, but it needs to be working for Auckland. There needs to be a mechanism where Auckland's views and concerns are heard and given due consideration, and we make that work for us. So it's not, as you say, some unelected officials making some big calls. And if that goes to deciding, well, what service levels are acceptable, then that becomes a real challenge. So it's getting that regulation right and working for Auckland is a key thing.
And the point you made in regard to regulator and the democratic institutions, that's hinted at in the discussion of service levels in the submission.
Thank you, Councillor. Next we have Councillor Lee, who will be followed by Councillor Fletcher. So, Councillor Lee.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. In the report, clause 17, development levies will be charged across levy areas that cover an entire community. That almost suggests that the entire community will be liable for part of the levy. That's the way it's worded. That's not right, is it?
So it's not the levy will still only be charged to developers. So the levy is still a charge on development, but it is intended for it to be across broader areas than current development contributions.
Just the word community, we're talking about a geographical area rather than a group of people.
Yeah, so this is a phrase that the DIA use, and they talk about a community of interest, and they try to look at a group, an area that that incorporates one single community.
I'd stick to area rather than.
It's probably easier. Yeah.
And the second point, that obviously this is an ongoing, continuing story going back years now, but you pointed out in clause 29 of your report, development levies will need to support both the existing planning system under the Resource Management Act and the new planning system. And again, in clause 31, alludes to that as well. The use of urban containment policies, or abolishing or reducing restrictions on the use of urban containment policies, the rural, i.e. the rural-urban boundary in Auckland's case, and the removal of other planning barriers to free up land at the urban fringe. But would this levy act as a disincentive to land banking? Because you can have all the rules about freeing stuff up, But once a developer gets hold of a block of land, they're not required to develop it. Even on the Auckland Isthmus, there are significant areas that are even consented but still land banked. So that's not helping growth or house supply, blah, blah, blah. Will this be a mechanism to disincentivise that behaviour or not? Or will it go past it?
No, it wouldn't. It would be very similar to development contributions in that manner. It would not provide any disincentive for land banking.
Okay. And finally, again, this is a revenue item, a budget item, but actually, as you indicate in your report and the submission, that it also relates to planning and legislation and so on. In the new legislation, councils across the country will be obliged by the government, by the state, to come up with spatial plans. This approach of deregulating planning and freeing up and removing barriers and et cetera, actually on the face of it is a contradiction with spatial planning as such, or it could be said that it makes spatial planning pretty easy because you'll be able to do what you want, where you want, under this legislation. Is that a point that is worth raising in your submission? What is the role of, it does reflect on what the government's intention is for spatial planning, which is going to, knowing how it works, is going to cost this council, even though we've got one, a lot of money to come up with a spatial plan and time. That needs to be mentioned because I think there's a sort of a philosophical contradiction here if you take these words seriously. Thank you.
Yes, I do think you have raised an issue that we're very aware of, and we have actually addressed that in the submission in the part on the integration with the planning bill. So I think it's the region, how it interrelates with the regional spatial plan is very key, and how we describe where the infrastructure is going to be built, and that is really where that link to that bespoke levy assessment process that we talked about needs to be coordinated, so that if we, for example, plan to put infrastructure here, but then growth wants to go over here, and we haven't indicated that in spatial plan, we need to have a very clear mechanism that would trigger the bespoke levy assessment and give us the ability to figure out how that's going to be managed. For example, if we plan to build some piece of infrastructure next decade and a developer wants it built today, then that will have some ability to, they've talked about a first mover principles. For example, if the developer says, hey, I'll build it, but it will service a wider community. This proposal actually allows the developer to build it, finance it, but council to collect levies from other developers who benefit and repay that particular developer. So we think that's a good provision, but it is complex and will take time and work to really make it work for us. So yes, absolutely are very conscious of that interplay.
Very good. Thank you for the answer. Thank you for the question. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I guess I really feel that developer contributions haven't been entirely satisfactory. So in some ways, I welcome the proposal for change, but I just want to better understand parts of it, and in particular, water. Historically, water care were excluded from developer contributions, and just in terms of better understanding the situation with water care going forward, can the officers give some further rationale as to how that might work more effectively than what we've seen?
So the current consultation document and exposure draft are pretty limited in their discussion of how development levies would apply to water entities, and that is a key part of the feedback that has been provided by Watercare. Watercare are keen to have this as an option for them, and for them to potentially look at using development levies in the future, whereas at the moment their method for recovering growth costs is through infrastructure growth charges, which are a contractual relationship between them and developers. So there's key parts of the feedback that we're making, which is asking the government to consider enabling water entities, including Watercare, to be able to use this new system, and then a number of other factors, such as the one raised earlier about Veolia, that would need to be part of that if that went forward.
Setting aside the Veolia situation, which is unfortunate and complex, and given historically the enablement that the water bodies have had, Watercare, in terms of their ability to charge independent of council, and I don't mean this to be a sort of performance review on them, but has it been satisfactory in your eyes as an officer? I just want to understand if we're going to change from what we've had into something new, have Watercare availed themselves satisfactorily using the tools that they already have?
I'd let Rebecca
follow on that. Would you like me to answer?
I think one of the key points is that the situation for Watercare is changing anyway, given their new regulatory environment, and so that opens them up to considering some broader options. Rebecca?
I saw a notice in the chat that I need to introduce myself. So I am Rebecca Vanson, Executive Officer, report to Jamie Sinclair, CE. I have a commercial finance and strategy background. So Watercare's IGC have been working in practice, and I think that this development levy regime actually looks quite similar to an IGC. We would like the ability to adopt a development levy if some changes are made, and also similar to council, where we can't actually confirm if we like the development levy regime because there's not enough information around methodology and I guess definitions and a lot of things actually. However, ideally we would like to be nationally consistent. We don't want to be the Auckland special. It would be better if we are consistent with the national regime, and the other water entities, I believe, will be charging a development levy. So it would make sense for us to be aligned.
Thank you for that. And obviously this is going to be of great interest going forward, but I look forward to working with you. But thanks for introducing yourself.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I think the last question might be from the Mayor Brown.
Okay, thanks for that. I generally support the submission, but it's quite full and I could miss bits and pieces I was looking for. There's a couple of things that I want to make sure they're in there somewhere or other. Is that, first of all, that growth hasn't been paying for growth. I mean, this is a very slogan-centred government, and it sounds great, growth will pay for growth, but it doesn't. And then DCs, of which I've paid some, and not loved by the industry, who pays them, of course, and there's always confrontation between council and developers over the contributions. And I don't think it's made clear to everybody that the levies are going to be a bloody sight bigger. And they're not going to go over, they're not going to be hugely popular with, even if they're fully justified, and I support them. But we have to our submission should point out, these will be substantially bigger than the already difficult to enforce development contributions. And there will be conflict between us and the development, and the impact of the levies at the size they are is that once they're known, they will actually stop quite a lot of development. which is not in itself a bad thing, because quite a lot of them are curb places, which is rather stupid to do it anyhow. But we need to highlight it will have an impact. And I think that the other thing it's going to point out, because I get lectured by various ministers who've never built a bloody thing in their lives, but they lecture me. And council is holding the whole sector up. But in fact, there's 9,500 resource consents out there granted by the council, which no one's doing anything about. And I think we need to put that in there somewhere or other. The council's not, the resource management isn't holding things up. The economy is holding things up. And so please fix the economy while you're buggerising around with these things would be quite a thing to put in there. So it's just the kind of balancing thing in there, the kind of that needs to go fairly near the front rather than be buried in the detail. It's a high point thing is that these are going to cost a lot more. So put it in, please, will you? That's my question.
Thank you. So that point about, you know, current DCs not paying for growth, we've tried to include that there in the introduction, the challenges with the existing DC regime. Around developers not liking DCs, I'm aware that they've been pretty clear with the Minister that they don't like DCs, and also as to what they would like from the new regime, and have been advocating thus. In terms of the size of DLs, development levies, going forward, and there is this expectation that they will be much higher. That seems to be quite loud in the public discourse. Minister seems to think they'll be much higher. What we don't have at this stage is enough detail in what the government are proposing to be able to confirm that. We don't know that this regime will allow or will drive much higher charges. And in any case, you know, the aim is still only for growth to recover growth. And so the size of the charges will be reliant on the level of investment any council commits to in their area to support growth. And as we've talked elsewhere, that can be limited by other factors such as rates capping. So yes, I think there is this sort of expectation that the charges will be much higher, but at the moment we don't have enough information to confirm that. And Ross?
Maybe just to add to that, I think some developers expect they might be lower because once there is regulation, things might magically reduce. I think if this policy is successful, again, if this policy does achieve growth paying for growth, the levies will have to be higher, but it's not clear whether that will happen. So either levies are higher or growth doesn't pay for growth. So we don't know whether it will achieve, though we're not really clear whether levies will be higher and it will achieve the objective or not, and we won't know until we see some of that detail.
Without the detail, even you can tell them they're going to have to be higher, mate, so you may as well mention that. The possibility they might be lower is possible, so might pigs fly.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Ferry, you had a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I've got a different question now. I've sort of had a quick look at the water care submission, but I'm not sure if it covers it. So in a situation where, for some reason, an existing property, so they wouldn't attract a developer levy or a developer contribution under the current scheme, but they don't have a water connection, and they do want to connect, is there a possibility that part of that water connection charge is actually going to be in play here or not? I see there's some stuff in the water care submission about service connection, but I'm just wanting to check that. Is it likely that, well, do we already have a situation where part of the service connection is actually effectively about the network growth? And if we do, how will that be factored into this? Sorry, that's quite a technical question.
Can I clarify your question?
Yeah.
Are you asking if there is a subdivision and there is the section at the back does not have any services, that they will be charged a development levy?
No, I'm asking if we have a house that currently, so it's already
Yes.
been developed, they would have paid a developer contribution whenever it was built, but they're for some reason not connected to the water services, but the services are there and they could connect. If there is a component of the connection charge that is already about contributing to the network growth, how would we take that into, would they, well, they wouldn't pay twice because the developer contribution's already been paid for that property. Would that effectively remove that portion of the connection fee, or will they
They wouldn't have paid the development levy for water. So if they don't have a water connection, they would not have paid it, an IGC or whatever it was. So when they apply to Water Care for a service connection, that is the time that they would be eligible to charge the applicable levy.
Right, so
And that is part of the submission from Water Care, is that in order for this system to apply to water entities, the connection to the network would need to be a trigger separately to the current trigger, which is consenting.
yeah, I think that's the bit I
So
was looking at.
that's in
but I didn't
that
quite
Water
understand.
Care piece.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Another big element of the Water Care submission is being able to capture major increases in demand when a factory changes its water use.
Yeah, thanks very much. I had a specific constituent question around that. That's why I was asking. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Member Wilson, you had another question.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, still got my training wheels on as it relates to procedure here. Look, I'm just wanting a partai that relates to the recommendation and the wording of the recommendation. Is that now through you, Mr. Chair, or is it later?
If you have a question about it, you ask it now. Yeah.
It doesn't appear anybody else's as well. So my partai is this in terms of what I posed earlier, and it says that in terms of the chair and the group chief financial officer to approve the final submission, including any minor or technical amendments or appropriate amendments in response to committee feedback prior to lodgement. So my partai is what I was asking for in terms of incorporation of the submission from Haukura is not minor technical amendment or an appropriate amendment to include. Is that right? I just need to know and understand why that couldn't form part of that recommendation. So that's my first partai in the first instance.
So that's been our assessment that we've made this morning, is that working through that would not qualify as a technical change or minor. That there's some where we need to work through the implications in order to be satisfied that they would be, aligned and not seen as just technical.
So can you just use the words by which you do not believe it fits? So it is what, in essence, around why it cannot be incorporated?
So there's some parts of the submission that's come through that could have implications that, in terms of cost, that the committee needs to consider before incorporating it into their submission, in terms of the way in which issues are dealt with and whether those are dealt with through and funded, and whether they should be funded through a sharing mechanism such as levies or one through rates. And those are complex issues that I think we need to sit and work through carefully, rather than, I think it's more than just a technical edit to the submission.
As is all of the papers we're seeing here today, as are the kōrero that's being presented by each of the councillors, they all fall in the same vein, I guess. and yet there would be consideration given to those. I'm not understanding, and I'll leave it at that. I'm not understanding why it does not fall into any one of those. It's still a mystery to me. Mr. Chair, I'm going to leave that there for the time being. The other thing I still got my training wheels on here, in the sense that delegated authority to the chair, is there in the wording here, the Haukura member as well as the chair, the group chief financial officer and a member from Haukura? Is that how it normally is represented in the recommendation?
That's kind of typically what we've done for these kind of financial policies. But it's up to the committee chair if they want to have, if you want a different delegation around these editorial changes, the committee can choose something different. But this is kind of where it's editorial changes on financial things. That's kind of the standard approach we've used for financial policies.
So I'm of the understanding that Haukura would provide a member, but I don't see it there in terms of delegating authority and being part of the chair and or group chief financial officer. Can you just confirm that for me, please?
No, so normally it would just be the chair and chief financial officer for a finance related item. I think that's what Ross was saying.
Thank you, I think.
That brings us to the end of the question session. So thank you very much for fielding those questions. You can step back from the table now and we'll move into the comments and debate. Okay, so I'll just up on the screen there you'll see the motion. Do I have a mover or seconder for it? I'm happy to move it. Richard will second it. And so it's live. So any comments or debate? Okay, nothing online. I take it there being none then, I'll put the motion. I'll do it on voices. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against?
Aye.
I declare that carried. All right, thank you. Well done, members. Okay, well, I think we'll move straight on to the next item.